I'd like to acknowledge the land that we work on and enjoy here at Trent, which is the territory of the Mi'kmaq, Anishinaabe, and part of Treaty 20. It's beautiful river that runs through our campus. So we are all very grateful for this place. So thank you for being here. The focus on Indigenous education is part of many sort of things coming together at Trent. There have been documents brought forward at Senate, faculty board. We have at the Center for Teaching and Learning tried to have a strong energy and emphasis on Indigenous education and how we can support instructors, teaching assistants, students in developing their understanding of Indigenous knowledge, content, and perspectives. And it's not just in Indigenous studies, which is often sort of a common misconception, but across the academy. And so this gives us a chance to really think about that today. We have a spectacular panel with us. I'll start by introducing myself, who is not on the panel. I am just moderating. My name is Kathy Bruce. I'm the Dean of Education, Teaching and Learning, and one of my responsibilities is to oversee the Center for Teaching and Learning, who's hosting this event today. And I'm going to work my way this way. So on my left next is Dawn Harvard. She's the Director of the First Peoples House of Learning and a strong advocate for Indigenous women nationally, recognized internationally for all of her work. Next to Dawn is Phil Abbott, and you're going to help me if I get something wrong, but Phil is a PhD candidate in Indigenous Studies. He teaches some fourth year coursework and is a youth coordinator for Katimanuk. And his area of research is on cultural history.
Sounds good, yeah.
Okay.
Well done.
You feeling good about that?
Yeah.
Next is Paula Sherman. Paula's been here for a while. I feel like we started about the same time. She is the director of the Indigenous Studies PhD program. The focus of her work is on Indigenous histories and Indigenous women. And last but not least is Paula Henderson. Paula, I see you again today. We were just together yesterday. She works both with the School of the Environment and Indigenous Studies. Her area of interest is Indigenous food systems, and she's a farmer too, so that's really interesting. So what we've done is we've got 3 questions to ask the panelists, and they have like exactly 1 hour to address these questions. And we may not get through them all, but we were asked at our last panel to make sure there was enough time at the end for questions and discussion more broadly. So I am going to abruptly end the panel discussion to make sure that we get to questions from others. So there are 3 questions. The first is, and we might tumble these all together, but the first one is and I've changed the wording a little bit, but how do non-Indigenous instructors successfully integrate and teach Indigenous content in their courses? It's a question that Center for Teaching and Learning gets asked a lot, and it's probably a tiresome question in some ways, but still needs to be discussed. The second one is, what specific strategies do you use in your courses and your coursework that are effective at bringing in Indigenous content and knowledge? And the third is, what's one thing that you would recommend to everybody here and to start doing today? And what specific action should faculty be taking? So those are the 3 items. Maybe what we'll do is we'll tackle question 1. See how that goes first. So I'm just going to have to remember all 3. And we don't have to go in order. We can shake this up a little bit when someone's ready to start. The first question then, how do non-Indigenous instructors successfully integrate and teach Indigenous content in their courses? Who would like to start? Oh, see?
Perfect.
Okay, Dawn.
Actually, so I think we need to back the question up a little bit and I'll tell you a little story about when my oldest daughter, who's actually now a Trent student, was in grade 3, I got the phone call from the teacher saying, you know, we're teaching our Native Studies unit and I'm not really confident about my Indigenous knowledge, it's probably Aboriginal back then, and said, you know, I don't want to get it wrong, so can you come in and teach the unit? And I came in, I thought I did a great job, but afterwards I was sitting down and I realized that there's some fundamental problems here. Number one, simply being the Indigenous parent of an Indigenous student doesn't actually make me qualified for anything other than maybe some parenting classes, but it's, you know, I could have been anybody. I could have gone in and really done a lot of damage to those students in the classroom. She happened to get very lucky. We actually had a situation in Toronto School Board where they had invited an elder in and he gave his presentation, and one of the little boys actually asked a question, you know, put up his hand at the end and says, you know, do you have a wife? And this elder, very, you know, humor is very much a part of our tradition, and so he jokingly replied that, oh yes, he had many wives and many girlfriends. So these kids went home and told their parents that, you know, the Anishinaabe people are polygamous. Like, we had some major work to deconstruct all of the damage that had happened. And so, you know, while it's really important to bring in local experts, which is number one most important thing, at the same time, you have to know your experts. You have to build a relationship with them so that you know who you're bringing in and what they're going to say. I've had teachers bring in an RCMP officer who had spent a lot of their time in the far north and was going to talk to the classroom about Indigenous peoples, and I thought, wow, like what a truly profoundly bad idea. Can you imagine? Like the only time he sees people is at the worst point in their lives when people are in conflict. And so this is the perspective you're going to impart onto some students who may never have met an Indigenous person, or at least didn't know they had. But it really all circles back to the fundamental question of how do we accept such ignorance and incompetence on Indigenous issues in what are supposedly trained professionals? Because I went home and I was talking to my husband about this, and he says, well, you know, you got to understand. And I said, no, I don't understand, because quite frankly, the teacher would never have called me and said, you know, I'm not really confident about my knowledge of fractions, and we're going to have Timmy's dad teach that unit. Because we expect certain basic competencies if you're going to be in these positions. And I think that's number one. So is really to educate yourself, you know, to read a story, to watch a film about the residential schools, and for goodness sakes, if you're going to show it with your students, watch it before you show it to the students, because there's some really good stuff out there, and there's some really damaging, truly awful stuff out there, and it is still on the ministry website, so you have to be really careful. But that was, you know, one of my most fundamental things is that we can't wait to some magic point where Indigenous people should be teaching this in every classroom. Because just numbers wise, if every Indigenous man, woman, and child in this country went through your program and got a teaching degree, we still wouldn't have enough Indigenous people to teach the Indigenous content in all of the classrooms and all of the educational institutions across the country. So everybody who is going to be educating in any context has to have a minimum competency and comfort level. I think the most important thing is to ask, to admit that you don't know it, and to be okay with that, and to start learning. Because even for me, there's always something more to learn.
Thanks, Don. That was a good story. I remember when my daughter was in grade 3 and she was being taught about pioneers, and we had to discuss that at home and get different education. So I teach, what I try to focus on when I teach is around the history specifically of this area, or of what is now Ontario. And I usually start by discussing how the dominant narrative of history that we're taught in schools, and it's starting to change, which is good, but I think it's still there. That narrative of history renders Indigenous presence, settler colonization, and I would say Indigenous resistance invisible. So students are coming into university really unaware of their own history. So I think there's many ways that we can approach this shifts in society and work towards active reconciliation. And the approach that I take is around trying to change this understanding of history, but it's not easy because it takes a lot. Well, I won't tell you how long into my PhD I am. My supervisor is sitting beside me. But I'm well into it, and it's been researching the history of Treaty 20 area, and a lot of the stuff I found was pretty shocking to me because it really isn't available. If we walk around and look at historical plaques and things like that, that's not the history you find. So it takes a lot of work to learn that, and I think Don made a really good point that it is about going out and doing some of that hard work to figure it out. And it is, when teaching, it definitely is important to have guest speakers come in and give context to things, but I think there is some, it's incumbent on settlers, which I am to position myself, I'm a non-Indigenous person, a settler. It's incumbent on us to also be doing some of this work, right? It's not incumbent on Indigenous people, and it's not incumbent on Dawn to be asked to go into this class necessarily, as she was saying, right? I think we need our teachers to be better educated, but understanding that, especially in the public system right now, there's big changes to the curriculum, but I know that a lot of the teachers that are there are not comfortable teaching that. And I can see that the Faculty of Education has been doing a lot. I have a lot of some education students in my class, and they're much more aware, I think, than some of the teachers that are already in the system. So that's important to have that shift, but it takes a lot of work to learn about this kind of stuff. I know we're on a timeline, so I just want to touch on a few other things. One way to conceptualize that, I think, and it's, I heard this from a talk I saw from a scholar at UBC called Cole Thrush that Paula and I have used in our class. And he talks about the need to bear the burden of settler colonial history. And I think really, if you think of it, Indigenous people have been bearing that burden just by the way that society is structured. And the privilege of being a settler means that if you just follow this dominant narrative of history and don't sort of dig into this history, you can avoid it. You don't bear that burden because the way that history is taught is that this isn't, we're taught in a way that this isn't a settler colonial society, that sort of white people just arrived and everything was kind of okay. Which is definitely not the case. So I think by starting to learn some of this history, settlers start to bear that burden a bit. And then when you do bear that, you have to process that. And there's a few things that can come with that. When non-Indigenous people learn these kind of things in the classroom, there can be a feeling of guilt, and that's very normal. And I think Indigenous people can have feelings of anger, which is also very important. And I think with the guilt thing, it's important to move beyond feelings of guilt into feeling something that's more active. So I think when we teach history, we often are taught in Western approaches to history that it's not sort of a personal thing. We're disconnected from it. But I think we need to take these points in history and connect them to the present, and then we can get emotional about it and feel something about it. And if you're feeling something about it, then you can get angry and figure out ways to sort of move forward. So a great example of that is when I explore the history of the Trent waterway and the pollution from the mills into the rivers and lakes in this area. So because of the flooding and because of the pollution, wild rice, or monoman, was seriously affected over time. And there hasn't been as much monoman in recent times. And then a few years ago, there was all that stuff happening at Pigeon Lake. And that's a lot of what the cottagers were saying at Pigeon Lake was due to their ignorance about this history. Some of the cottagers actually said there's never been wild rice on Pigeon Lake. And well, yes, there has. I mean, that's an unbelievable statement, but they can say that because their grandfather bought the cottage in 1960, and in Pigeon Lake was one, it had been flooded, so it no longer was a marshland that was full of wild rice, and it was also probably the most polluted it had ever been at that point. So I think the reasons that kind of stuff has happened is we're disconnected with that past because it is uncomfortable. So the most important thing would be to learn about that history, and I think that would help everybody moving forward, students and instructors. And I will let Paula take over. The two Paulas.
The two Paulas.
Yeah.
The co-Paulas. So I guess when I really think about this question, I think it's really important to actually think about the idea of positionality, like anything you're saying. Because even for me, as an Algonquin person, that doesn't make me an expert on everything Indigenous. That goes back to what Dawn is saying. Like even when I was working on my dissertation, which is about Algonquin-Mohawk relations, I'm not Mohawk, so I don't have the authority to actually speak about how they understand their relationships with us as people. So it comes down to the idea of what is our positionality in relation to the knowledge of the topic that we're going to be discussing in class. That these things are vitally important, because if we don't have a relationship to the knowledge, then that makes it, or the topic, that makes it very difficult for us to teach it in a way that's going to make students feel passionate about it too, as well, right? So I think it's also important to, in all of these courses, whether there's Indigenous or non-Indigenous people teaching them, is to make sure that students have access to, and that we're really privileging Indigenous sources, Indigenous readings, that they have access to other Indigenous peoples as well. Like I'm saying, because even if it's me teaching the course, I can't present how Mohawk people or Innu people or Inuit people, or like I teach a course that's about colonial encounters around the world. So even being an Indigenous person doesn't make me have the positionality to be able to teach on all these various different Indigenous peoples around the world. So it's very important that we find, adequate and ethical sources really to use in that kind of context. In my classes, my 2 undergrad classes right now are online classes. So how I've positioned these classes, they're history classes, I've created 4 units on the foundations for understanding Indigenous history. Because you can't really understand Indigenous history unless you understand the foundation in which it is developed and understood. So there are these foundations, and then once you get past that, then you can kind of begin to really think about like the first foundation being land. Like land is the first foundation for understanding Indigenous history as well as different Indigenous knowledges, and it can't just be essentialist male or female ideas of knowledge, because that's also one of the things that's really been colonized, because in lots of Indigenous contexts, gender is more fluid, and then in the way we talk about it a lot, So
Could you continue with the series? So land,
yeah,
and then
land, knowledges, genders, and then positionality and ethics, right? So if you focus on all of those as foundations for understanding Indigenous history, then it really situates the students. Like, so in my Indigenous Women in Settler History course, we're looking at how Indigenous women have been portrayed historically, and how the ways in which Indigenous women have been portrayed historically has a direct impact on how Indigenous women are treated today, including missing and murdered Indigenous women, right? Like Bev Jacobs had a really good article that she did for Amnesty International that really made those connections with the historical portrayal of women and the amount of Indigenous women who are being murdered and are missing today. So there are direct connections, and not just in Canada, but all around the world. Indigenous women all around the world are having the same kind of issue. So all of those foundations, and then, but it isn't just it isn't just our positionality. I think our positionality really kind of frames everything, but the sources are important, the readings that students are exposed to, making sure they're exposed to Indigenous elders and knowledge holders, to people of different genders, so that they're not just getting a essentialist female or male idea of knowledge. It's funny because I have a friend in KI, and we were discussing, they were really interested in stopping mining that was happening up there, and so this really famous guy who does a lot of ethnographic kind of research, he went up there during the time when they were doing moose hunting, and he went to they have 2 moose hunting camps, one is a male and one is a female camp, and he only went to the male camp where the men are. And I'm like, well, Jacob, do they even know what happens in the women's camp? He's like, we don't know really. I'm like, well, like it's like half of the knowledge of that community about how to relate in that place isn't being considered, and so all of these kinds of things are really important. So I think the other thing that's really important is thinking about our approaches to assignments, to making sure that students have the ability to also consider and use oral sources and not just white male written historical documents, because they're not usually very accurate. So there are all of those kinds of things. Like one example, just to build on, I think what Phil was saying, have any of you ever seen the Canadian Citizenship Guide? Anybody looked at the Canadian Citizenship Guide? Like there are 2 versions, a more recent version, and I heard Trudeau is doing a new one and so I haven't seen that yet. But if the two versions, like Phil and I have used it in 2305 before we were working together in the course, and it's really interesting to look at it because both examples of it, the very first sentence starts, at one point Indigenous, well they say Aboriginal, at one point Aboriginal peoples lived in Canada. What's wrong with that sentence?
Pretty much everything.
Yeah, like, well, first of all, it's making an assumption that Canada has always existed, and that it's a foregone conclusion that Canada has always existed, which there's like a paragraph and a half in the entire guide about Indigenous peoples. You know, and the US one is not any better. Like the US one, the Australia one, the New Zealand one, every place there's a settler society, there are these kinds of things, and like Phil's saying, what they do is they shape understanding in a particular way that erases us as people, that erases our long-standing relationships with our homelands, you know, all of those things I think that are really important. So I could probably go on, but I'll pass to Paula and then we can kind of continue on.
Okay, thanks. It's a little intimidating coming at the end of these three here. But I think for me anyway, and I can only speak from my own place and the work that I'm doing, is that this question of how do non-Indigenous people successfully teach or bring this content in it's a work in progress. It's a continual progress and work on how did this work, did it not, what were the outcomes of it, and then having to change things up. So part of the process is really getting, understanding your position. For me, that's taken a while to really understand, and then connect your position, where you're from. For me, I'm a settler Canadian. My ancestors come from England and Scotland and Norway. And so thinking about what that position brings with me to my teaching, my assumptions, my way of being, the way of doing, really, so for me, where we all need to start is taking a look at ourselves. And sometimes it's not pretty, you know what I mean? Like we actually really have to take a look at our positionalities, because one of the things I think we can best do in the classroom is be the example. So how the processes you've gone through, what you share about your journey, how you do that and how you example it to your students based off of your positionality is really important, right? Because it really honors who you are, it honors your position, and it also honors the Indigenous people of this place. And so for me, that's a big journey, and for many people, depending on your position, that journey is going to look quite different, right? And so, but I think that's where we really need to start to really jump in. And once you're on that journey and you've been working on that sometimes very uncomfortable places you find yourself, that is where the big learning happens, and also that is where the authenticity comes in how you teach about these things in a lot of ways. So for me, that's where I start. And then, so for me, the other things is, one is the exampling it, but is also whenever you're bringing knowledge into your classrooms or within your course content, it's really important to acknowledge what is your relationship to it. And so I'll give an example. So even though I'm doing my PhD in Indigenous Studies, I've actually been teaching at Trent for about 10 years, but in the Sustainable Agriculture and Food program. So I teach a Canadian food systems class. It's fantastic. You know, and we learn all about the Canadian food system. Now, I could just start with, 150 years ago, the Canadian food system, right? We could just start there. Just start with the pioneers, that whole concept. We could start there. But if I'm going to be responsible for my position and what I know in terms of settler colonialism and the impacts it's had, we need to be starting somewhere totally different. So in my Canadian food systems class, that is the first thing we do. We look at what are food systems that we brought with us as settlers, what did they displace, and what have been the impacts of doing that. And so it grounds the whole conversation right from the beginning in a totally different way. And as a settler person, by speaking to that up front, in my positionality, but bringing that to the forefront in our classroom and our conversation, we actually find that throughout the whole semester, we keep coming back to this. We have a way to bring that back into the conversation again and again and again. And so it really, it's a really powerful way to start. But the other thing that we, in that particular class, and I'm just trying to give examples so that, you know, depending what disciplines you're already teaching, and you could start to think, okay, where do these things intersect, and how do they intersect, and what are my responsibilities to bring forward in that conversation? So, so as a settler person, my ancestors came and settled on the south shore of Rice Lake. And so talking about the Trent Severn Waterway, so there my ancestors are, the 100-acre farm, that whole, wow, I'm just starting with the Canadian food system on, right? So the first thing is there's no rice left in Rice Lake. So what did my ancestors have to do with that? What is the position going on there? Now I have a friend, James Wheaton, who's been working in this community. He's a knowledge holder from Curve Lake First Nation, and I've been doing a lot of work with him. I've known him for almost 20 years and have worked directly with him for 10 years on the revitalization of Minoman, or wild rice, in this region. And so we start off thinking about what the impacts of settlement has had on these landscapes here, and how we've based all our privilege and all these amazing foods we have, whole local food movement, all that stuff is off of land that is not ours. You know, hasn't been done in the best way possible to share the landscape. So we need to think about these things. But what we also do is we go out ricing with James. We actually go and spend the day with him out on the water at his place learning about Minoman. And we do that so that he can have his own voice, so it's not always through me. Right? So that he can have his voice, so he can speak his truth about that and provide a different perspective than I can as a settler on that same situation, right? And actually in many places, James and I go and have often spoken together, because there's things as a settler that I can say and are actually my responsibility to say about Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationships that are actually shouldn't be left to him to have to say, you know, as an Indigenous person. And so when we speak together and we can cover different kind of ground, and we can open it up to different kinds of conversations. So that's been a really helpful tool as well. So connecting directly to people in the ways that you do have that knowledge, and acknowledging where you get your knowledge from. What are the relationships that have allowed you to speak about these things in the first place? Be it your personal relationships, your relationships to community, elders, knowledge holders, to what readings, who are the authors, like all of that kind of stuff. Because we tend to give, like in our classes, we talk about, you know, that reference, the reference list, you know. You don't want to plagiarize. Well, if you're not acknowledging from whom your knowledge is coming, you are plagiarizing. You're appropriating that knowledge. So it's really important to example how that is done for your students, to relearn what appropriate relationship is through that, and how we should do that in a good way. And it takes a long time. So you're going to make mistakes. That's the other thing. You're going to make mistakes. And you have to be open enough to be able to hear when that happens, right? Which is not always pleasant, but that's part of this learning process. The other one thing, and I had a whole list of things because I really had been trying as a teacher, I've been thinking a lot about this. One of the things that I think that does happen sometimes is in a classroom you have both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Some Indigenous students will identify themselves as such, or you might know, which is fine. But it's really, really, really important that you don't rely on your Indigenous students to do your work for you, right? Because they're on their own journeys of trying to recover from colonialism and recover and revitalize their own traditions and knowledge. So to put that burden on them, they're here to learn, right? So it's really important. Now, if they choose to share, that's one thing, but it's really important how you set up your conversations in classes, how that happens, that you aren't putting that back on the Indigenous students to be actually doing your job for you. And also, I think it's really important to create safe spaces to have some of these conversations. So students, Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, actually, like Phil was saying, there can be really quite different reactions about the knowledge and the learning that's happening in a classroom. So you need to be really cognizant of that. And we often talk about what is respectful dialogue? How does that take place? How do we set some ground rules collectively so that we are creating a safe space for everybody to learn in as we move forward collectively? So those are a few
Thank
things
you.
I've learned.
Okay, I believe Dawn wants one more.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to
Go.
comment a little bit. I usually like to sit at that end of the table so I get the last word. But I'll just circle back around. To comment a little bit on the positionality aspect, because you're absolutely right. The challenge is that our identities and our positionality is not cut and dry in nice little boxes that are easy. I mean, identities are very fluid. Identities are very dynamic. And it's certainly not simply Indigenous and settler. I mean, we have immigrants, we have refugees, we have, I mean, even the French-Canadian versus English conflict and being displaced, or that sense of being displaced, and that long history there, but also jokingly or derogatorily call people half-breeds. I mean, for my own identity, even though I identify as Anishinaabe, because in the Anishinaabe tradition, if you have, well, if your mother is Anishinaabe, you're Anishinaabe. If you have one drop of Anishinaabe blood, you're Anishinaabe. My father is Welsh. So yeah, when we get the letters home from the school saying everybody's family immigrated here from somewhere else, of course she got the big long essay back saying, hold on, no they didn't. My family on one side has been here since time immemorial, but on the other hand, you know, my father's family never stayed. They came over. My dad was, you know, during the war, he was a war orphan. The rest of my family is still in Wales. But that really points also to all of those identities have value. There is nothing inherently good or bad about either side. I mean, settlers had a lot of good things too. There was a lot of really proud, really strong, brave people who came here trying to escape the oppression in their own homelands, being persecuted in Scotland and Ireland and Wales. But, you know, and I often say, even when we go through these conversations in classrooms and we talk about the history of oppression in Canada, and you have this mixed reaction on behalf of Indigenous students getting very angry and non-Indigenous students feeling guilt at the same time, I say, you know, there is absolutely no need to feel guilt for the sins of our forefathers. I mean, my father was a biker, so I'm not going to be responsible for anything that happened, and I don't expect anybody else to. What I do expect, you're only responsible for what you do from here forward. You're only responsible for your learning and your positioning within privilege. I mean, if you're happily enjoying privilege, then yes, shame on you. You need to do something about that. You probably be a Trent though, so we're all good. At the same time, yeah, once you know something, instead of being paralyzed by shame and guilt, or sometimes there's this wanting so badly to be respectful that we do nothing because out of the fear of making a mistake, as you talked about. So you have to have the courage to make mistakes, the courage to ask, and the wisdom to listen. Because even if you're going to your community experts, even if you're going to your, you know, good academics, go to your most primary source. You know, don't read somebody's book about the Mississauga, who might be non-Indigenous. Go talk to your local elder. We have local elders right here, and talk to the actual peoples and hear their perspectives. So that's, you know, we often talk about reconciliation. Everybody wants to do reconciliation, but it's funny because we're actually leaving off half of that conversation. It was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's the truth aspect that is very quickly forgotten because we want to jump to the ending. We want to jump to the good part, the birthday cake of this conversation. I mean, nobody wants the healthy part that's good for you, the broccoli, and you know, that's the conversations about the history and the colonization and all of that stuff we have to get through before you get to the good stuff of, you know, the cultural background and the spirituality and all of those things. But we also have to remember that, as you said, that the diversity of our nations, right? That there is as much diversity even within nations. I mean, I'm Odawa, so I'm Anishinaabe, but I'm not from this territory, I'm not Mississauga. And Doug happily reminds me all the time when I say things wrong, as he should. And as a funny example of how these work, when everybody knows Bishka is the mentoring program here for Indigenous people, which was given the name by an Odawa elder in our language. And Bishka means like rise up. in Odawa. Now, in Cree, it basically refers to your backside. So, really nice example of diversity among Indigenous peoples. What something might mean could mean something very different. And we have to be really careful about saying, no, that's not the right way because I learned that from William Commanda or I learned that from Doug. That would be the right way for their community and their specific space and time. But we have seen a lot of that where, William Commanda is Algonquin. So even between Ojibwe from Kettle and Stony Point to Ojibwe on Manitoulin Island, there's dialect differences. My father's new girlfriend at a certain point was Ojibwe from Kettle Point and was busy teaching language stuff. And so there was a constant fight in my family because my mother's Ojibwe from Manitoulin Island saying, now that new woman's got it all wrong. She doesn't speak the language properly. But it's dialect differences. So it's really, really important to remember that, our culture and our language, it wasn't written down. There's no rule book, especially for protocols. So we can't think that offering tobacco is, that's important for Mississauga, but that's not if you're Innu or Inuit. And so we have to be really just open to asking and saying, I want to learn. Please let me know what is the appropriate protocol for asking. Because even with offering tobacco, you offer tobacco when you're asking somebody to do something for you. So a lot of elders, when you hand them tobacco, they won't accept it until you tell them what it is you're asking them to do. And at the same time, respecting those elders, respecting that knowledge, respecting our primary sources, as much as we respect those who have learned from it. As much, when we bring in elders, we're talking about honorariums, there's this conflict about, providing an amount of money for an elder who's coming in, and yet at the same, whether it be $200 for a day, they're coming in and providing this fabulous knowledge for your classroom, and yet, I pay my lawyer $450 for an hour. So what is Indigenous knowledge worth? And what are we doing to reproduce that relationship in terms of either reproducing it and disrespecting that knowledge, or really actively working towards a justice model by acknowledging the value of traditional knowledge?
I'm going to ask us to move on to the next question.
Questions.
That was probably
I've answered all of
the
them
most.
already.
Yeah, well, that question allowed us to wander the most. I think that was really great to hear everybody's thinking. I was thinking yesterday. I was working with or meeting with about 10 people from Indigenous studies. We were talking about what teaching looks like in those courses and how we talk about our teaching and how we think about our teaching and reflect on it. So this next question, I was just blown away by some of the things that people talked about at that meeting. But the question is, and I think it will be well received for you to talk about the specifics here, about some specific strategies that you use in your courses that you find to be particularly effective in bringing Indigenous knowledge and content to students in the university classroom. So maybe I'll jump to Phil.
Let's do it with Phil.
Is that okay?
Yeah. Thanks. So the first thing I would say, and it's been touched on, so Paula mentioned that we've taught a course together, and we've also done some other workshops together. And Paula, the other Paula, was talking about doing work with James Weetong around Bryce and that. So I think co-teaching is helpful, and Paula made a good point. I think there are places where, as a settler, I have something helpful to say. And when Paula and I taught a course about the history of colonization together, it worked really well because there were some really good things that we both could bring to it. And I think the students were able to take something from that, from an Indigenous person and non-Indigenous person teaching it. And also male and female as well, I think is a helpful difference. Another way to bring it in, I have learned a lot, but I'm a learner, I'm not. And with Indigenous knowledge, I'm careful of how I bring that into the classroom. So guest speakers is a great way to do that, but doing that in a respectful way. And I think Dawn touched on different ways to approach people and understanding that, to make sure that, and don't be afraid to ask as well, but make sure that you're approaching knowledge holders in a good way. And we need to find a better way to, I think, figure out how to compensate, because a lot of people are asked to come in over and over to different classes, and I don't think we respect that knowledge. That's a good point. Sometimes videos in classrooms can work, but I think we have to be very careful to make sure that we're not just showing some random YouTube video that is about Indigenous knowledge without maybe checking to see that that's vetted, sort of vet those videos some way with people that might be able to help you to understand that. And another way, when I do touch on aspects that I've learned, I think it's about referencing, and we're repeating ourselves, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So Paula mentioned that, and so when I touch on things that for example, I've been fortunate enough to spend a lot of time with Doug Williams and learned a lot from Doug. And if I'm touching on things that he's taught me, I'll always preface it, whether it's in writing or while I'm teaching and speaking, in saying that Doug Williams has helped me to understand this, or he's helped me to understand that. And I believe that's part of relational accountability. So that's sourcing Doug, that's knowledge that he's shared with me. And I want to make sure that I don't just say that without recognizing that that's where it comes from, just like we would, there's not really guidelines around that, around referencing oral histories, I think. And Don just touched on that as well. So I think that's another really important part of if you're going to incorporate anything that you've learned, is to reference where you've learned that. And ideally, that person could come in to contextualize it. If that's not possible, at least you can sort of put that out there that you, and be clear. I would be clear that I'm no expert in this, and I'm also learning. So I'm always clear about that when I speak about these things.
To me?
To you, I think.
Well, I think it's interesting. Like I think it just, as I said, goes back to the idea of positionality too. Like as an example, in the Indigenous Women in Settler History course, we look at different Indigenous women historically, and so oftentimes when you ask students what Indigenous women they can name, they'll say Pocahontas, and they may say Sacagawea, like because she's on the dollar U.S. coin. They may say Molly Brant, maybe, or Pauline Johnson, like in a Canadian context. So, for example, and as I said, my courses are online, so I set up the foundations for Indigenous history, and then we move into looking at Indigenous women, using the tools from those foundations to understand them. So, for instance, when we're looking at Pocahontas, Matokia, really, she's of the Powhatan Nation, which is in what is now Virginia. That's who she was historically, and obviously probably you've all seen the Disney film or the Disney Pocahontas movie or the New World movie, which came out later. Like, she's probably the most, I think there's been like 350 plays and all these different kinds of things that have been done about her. Like, her body is literally used in the service of history as a historical figure. So one of the things that I do is I look at all of the readings that are about her, and I look at them to see, did they have any contact with Powhatan people? In doing the research on her, did they connect to the nation? And then in doing that, I always provide a link to their nation's website. I provide a link to videos of Powhatan people speaking about her. Because getting back to my positionality, I'm not Powhatan, right? I can speak about her in the sense of understanding the complicated nature of how she's seen historically. But realistically, I am not of that nation, so I have to be really careful about what I say about her, so I make sure that who they're learning about her is from Powhatan people. And that's how I've set up the class. So we were looking at Watson, who is an Indigenous woman who was historically seen to be a prostitute even to Cortez historically. Like, she's seen, and she's a very complicated figure even in the sense of how Indigenous people see her in Mexico. So once again, I'm not of, the Mayan or Incan, or Aztec nations. They all kind of talk about her, so it just so happens that we have someone who's Indigenous from Mexico in our program right now, who is very happy to do a video lecture on her, which is actually now, and I also use VoiceThread, which in my online courses, which is really great because it allows for more of creating a virtual kind of seminar feeling online, so that you record yourself, you upload a PowerPoint, and it becomes a PowerPoint slide bank, and then you film yourself in video talking about the aspects, and then the students can actually respond in video as well. or audio or text, whatever they feel more comfortable with. So it creates more of a seminar kind of feeling in an online environment, which, you know, Blackboard isn't great at that. So it helps to create more of that kind of thing. So anyway, I have the slide presentation kind of set up in a way that we're taking those tools and we're using them. So what is the land base? What is the geography in which she comes from? How does who she is as a historical figure, in a sense, shaped by her homeland, by the language that her people speaks, by the, you know, looking as well at the historical relationship of her people, you know, because like in the case of Pocahontas, she was held captive on a ship and she was 9 or 10, you know, not like the Disney version of her. She was like 9, you know, so instead of talking about John Smith as like a, you know, a hero, he should be seen as a pedophile, like in the context of really thinking about that kind of thing. And I think that that's also the problem with how Indigenous women are seen historically. They're overtly sexualized as well, which is a big problem. So we look at all of those kinds of things, which leads us to the point, the very last slide that they consider and look at is, okay, now that we've considered this and we've looked at this, and I always put it into the context of the 7 generations. So we're in the 4th generation with 3 generations behind us and 3 generations in front of us. You know, so we're here, we've learned about the past, we've learned about these things, and now here we are as that 4th generation. What is our responsibility as historians? What is our responsibility as academics, you know, as people learning about that history? So what is our responsibility ethically in passing that on? What are the protocols and principles about that? You know, how does it help us to understand history better, to understand our relationship in this particular place? You know, and even in the context of what Paula was saying, you know, I also talked to all of the students when we're talking about the foundations for history. I asked them to look about where their ancestors came from, because there are, when we're in that 4th generation and we're going back looking at those 3 generations before us, every person here who's also in that same 4th generation, your ancestors, your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents, they shared values and teachings about how to understand the world with you. So what are those, and how can they help you to understand how to live in a good way here, right? So just because, you know, I'm Algonquin, I'm also a settler to Mississauga territory. This isn't my homeland either. You know, so it isn't just the idea, I think it's like Dawn said, it's not just the idea of us thinking about, you know, this binary between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, but you know, the complexity of what is now Canada today, you know, what is now the US or any of these kind of settler societies. The important thing is to work toward, I think, a place where our histories haven't been erased, where we are still here as people, you know, and I think that's why I think very passionately consider that our history has to be seen as history. Not as anthropology, not as archaeology, not as ethnohistory, but we actually have histories. And if they're not seen as histories, then we don't have autonomy and jurisdiction in our land. You know, and that's part of the way that history has been constructed to take away our autonomy and jurisdiction. And the only way we get that back is to walk in that and do it, I think. So, yeah. I don't know. I don't know which one of you guys want to speak to.
That's a lot. What do I have to add to this? I guess one of the things, let's see. One of the things that I think is really important as well is around pedagogy, or how we teach and how we learn. And so I have the real privilege of not only working and lecturing within the Sustainable Ag and Food program here at Trent, but I also get to work in the Indigenous Environmental Studies and Sciences program with Dan Longboat. So I actually co-teach a course with him, the Indigenous Food Systems course. And so one of the things, how Dan speaks about it, and it's so very, I think, really powerful in terms of thinking about how we go about doing this. He speaks about knowledges and what we can do with them is equipping ourselves with our tool belt. I see some IESS students here nodding, going, yeah, I've heard this, you know, but thinking about what are the tools we need today to be able to speak together, what knowledges do we have, and really the idea of knowledges, right? There's multiple ways of knowing, and being able to honor those histories and where they've come from, of ways of knowing how we find ourselves today and what our relationships are and tracing those back. And so Dan and I have really worked hard in the Indigenous Food Systems course to ground that whole course in Indigenous pedagogies, ways of knowing, learning, and doing. And so one of the big projects that the students do is because we do have this multiplicity. We have people from everywhere. I'd say a third of our students are international students. And they come in and they are like, I actually don't know much about Indigenous issues here in Canada. I want to learn. And food is a really nice starting spot for a lot of people because everybody has to eat, so we have a way to connect, right? But what we encourage people to encourage every student to do is their project is to take a food that is centrally important to them and their culture, and they start tracing it back. And so I'll just tell you this little story. Is that, so we had a young Saudi student, amazing student, just totally a gem to have in our class. And he was like, I'm researching the potato. We're like, oh, okay, go for it. Because in their traditional dishes, right now, what they would eat in their tradition, there's potatoes. Potatoes are a main thing of it. And so I'm gonna do that. And he spoke to his mother and his grandmother, and they also have to learn how to cook it, and we have a huge feast, so we're using all these different ways to know potato, right? And he comes back to seminar like weeks and weeks later. He's like, did you know potatoes aren't from Saudi Arabia? I was like, actually, when you started, I knew that. But he didn't, so what a journey. He was like, and then he started tracing it back, and that it came from South America, from Peru, right? And he was like, so all of a sudden he had this connection to indigeneity, to here, but also to his own place. And what a powerful way of learning through that pedagogy of tracing your own indigeneity back to your place of origin, and then realizing that where we go, there's so many connections. We are all so connected. So even though we find ourselves in challenging times, we also have lots of mechanisms to and knowledges that we can gather from, and learn from. And so these become how you choose to interact or how you choose to set the circumstances up for students to learn become really important. And so we've used that in that class. And we do things like, well, it's not just about learning it from books, but please reference your grandma. I was like, how important it is to reference your grandma. She knows something. Acknowledge her, in a really profound way for the knowledge that she holds on behalf of you and is passing down. So understanding where knowledge comes from in a different way, and honoring that, and in the different ways we get to learn and know. So that's really important. And also spending, and then we get to cook it, and we get to eat it, because knowing something is known in all of those different facets. It's just not book knowledge, right? We learn about something in many, many different ways. So really using that tool belt. And of course, we still look at the micro and macronutrients of potato and everything else in between, right? But we're using all of those ways of knowing so that we can get a whole picture. Another example of this kind of thing, which I'm always blown away with, is when we go ricing with James Wheaton and with my class. We go out in canoes and and it's amazing. And when we set out, I always ask James, how much do you want to say? Nothing. At the beginning, really nothing besides offering tobacco. He doesn't preface it a lot. He's like, before I fill everybody's heads with what I already know, you go introduce yourself to that rice. You go introduce yourself to that monoman out there in the lake. You go start a relationship with that rice in the lake. And when you come back, then we'll talk about what my relationship is, what your relationship could be. So it's, and students are often like, what am I supposed to get out of this? Because it's a really different way of knowing. But by encouraging them to do that and then reflect on that process of getting to know monoman, because once they've had, they're like, wow, this is amazing. Did you see how many bugs are? This creates a whole ecosystem. Like the birds and the muskrat and the beaver and everything is reliant on this, right? they come back that just from that experience, not by me saying it, not by him saying it, not by a book saying it, but through their direct experience. And then when we start the conversation about what the issues are, the situations are right now, they have a different relationship to begin with. And that's a really different way of knowing. So we can be thinking about these things as we approach all sorts of different topics and different things that we're trying to learn about and teach about in our classrooms as well.
So actually, I wanted to pick up on something a few you've mentioned. You know, when we're talking about history, or we're talking about, you know, how do we teach about Indigenous history? I've always been a little bit troubled by the fact that we can have history and then we have Indigenous history. How do we have a Canadian history class and not have it be fundamentally integrated with Indigenous history? Because otherwise that's the whole point, right? You're only telling half of that story. And I think, you know, that's sort of real history and Indigenous history, and it gets pigeonholed that way, kind of like Coke and Diet Coke, or and they had New Coke. It's really about integrating Indigenous content into everything, and that is a little harder, right? It takes time to look at whatever conversation we're having and find out, you know, what is the Indigenous perspective on this, whether we're talking about human rights, whether we're talking about food systems, whether we're talking about history. You know, stopping to take a minute and ask yourself, is there an Indigenous perspective on this? Is there an Indigenous experience on this? But at the same time, while we're making all of these really important connections, if we're incorporating Indigenous content into the same old craptacular system, are we really doing our students the best we can? And so sometimes it's about Indigenous pedagogies, which come from fundamentally different worldviews. So if you look at a Western model, and I'm not going to, you know, pick on anyone particular, but the very notion of man was put here to have dominion over the earth and all of the animals, and you know, you can almost see this pyramid where man is at the top, and then there's, you know, the animals and all these things all the way down, and that was his. Whereas among Indigenous people, man is way at the bottom, because he's actually the weakest of all creation. Cannot grow his own food, cannot even catch his own food, most of us, because I actually don't know where tacos live, so I can't grow tacos. And you know, we can't, we have to have skins from other animals to clothe us. You know, we're very fundamentally weak. And I say men, I'm actually not talking about women, but so in that context, you know, this different worldview gives you a very different approach to behavior. So in the Indigenous perspectives, if we're looking at how we're operating in a classroom, in Indigenous communities, it's all about the collective. The collective is the most important, as compared to the Western model where the individual is the most important, where it's all about individual achievement, sort of, you know, he who dies with the most toys wins, because it's all about amassing wealth, knowledge, and you know, your own personal, and maybe your family or your direct line, which is why, you know, inheritance was so important. Whereas in Indigenous community, it's all about the collective, and the individual and the family is actually subservient to the collective and the survival of the group, which can be seen, if you're looking at it from an outsider's perspective, as, you know, really upsetting that, you know, you feel that you as an individual or my family should be the most important, but no, sometimes, you know, the survival of our community is the most important. And that's why traditionally there was, you know, the ceremonial redistribution. So you got status in the community, not by how much you had, but by how much you gave away. And in communities where keeping everybody equal and not having competition is what helps us survive through the next winter, because we don't all survive if we don't all work together. And if we start to have competitive behaviors where, you know, I want more for me, or this one is the best, that really goes against a collective framework, and then you don't survive. So if our goal is to get us all through the next winter, because it's, you know, Canada and it's super harsh, we all have to work together. Indigenous societies actually work very hard to suppress that kind of individual achievement and focus on the collective. So you're going to see a lot more collaborative in Indigenous community, and it's interesting because that goes directly against your typical classroom, where everything is individual, where collaboration would be seen as cheating, you know, this, and especially when you go into Indigenous community, we used to find this with young teachers a lot, trying to teach them that, because they were constantly talking about how do I break my students of that behavior? Of, you know, they're constantly helping each other. I'm like, well, of course they're constantly helping each other. Most of them are probably family and they're related and but we, you know, they've been brought up since birth to help each other. And then you go to a classroom where that's seen as cheating. You know, stay in your little square, eyes on your own paper, no talking. And so instead of seeing how we break that, how do we embrace that? How do we use that so that we're working together? And again, you know, you're talking about different kinds of assessment. That's where, you know, working more collaboratively. And that can be hard, trying to introduce that, you know, sort of collaborative mentality into a framework that hasn't been used to that, but also being more holistic. I remember, as compared to sort of, you know, linear, fragmented, where you learn all of these little pieces, and someday you'll know what it's all about, because you'll be able to put all these together somewhere in grade 8, and it's all going to make sense. But in Indigenous community, we don't approach things from that kind of linear, fragmented perspective. It's about building success. It's about approaching things in a holistic way. I remember, you know, the first set of moccasins I made, I was so proud, and I ran, and, you know, I showed my grandpa, you know, I made these, and my grandma, at that point, she had done almost the whole moccasin. And then she handed it to me and said, okay, you sew on this little piece of trim. And I sewed on that last little piece. And I was so proud because I had made a pair of moccasins. But what she did was every time she just did a little bit less and a little bit less and a little bit less. But I was always making moccasins. I wasn't making little strips for something that I was going to learn about 3 years from now, because there's no meaning in that. There was no success. There was no sense of contributing to something here. So, you know, looking at things in a holistic way, the experiential aspect, 100%. You know, it's not about talking in theory about stuff in an abstract way. It's about doing it, because that is about really connecting. And that's, you know, when you're working in community, what it's all about.